Okay, in this video we're going to go over collisions in Unreal. And today we're just going to talk about collision object types. We're going to be looking at how to change collision settings. And then in another video we're going to go into line tracing and how that works. So hopefully by the end of this here you'll have a good understanding of object types. You're going to be able to change collision settings to meet your needs. And you're going to be able to set up custom collision object types as well within the project settings. So to begin with, in terms of object types, each object and each component of a blueprint has a certain collision type, okay, associated with it. In Unreal, you have maybe like 8 or 6 default collision types that are already built into the engine. And what we can do is, if we want to extend that, we can go into the project settings and create new object types. Now, the reason that you have different collision types is because you probably want in your game at some point different objects to react to other objects in different ways. So you want like a gun projectile to react to this target differently than you would say glass or something like that there. If we select an object in our scene, this here is a blueprint and it's made up of different components. So I'm going to select one of these components. I'm going to go for the static mesh, which is just the 3D object. And in the details panel, I'm going to scroll down and we've got this collision section. So in here, we can actually look at and determine what object type this is. And to do that, we have to go down to collision presets and we have to open this up. And you can see here that it's got an object type of World Dynamic. And below that, it shows you how it's going to respond to other object types, okay? So these are object responses. So this is going to block everything, okay? So we've got an object type of light, destructible, vehicle, physics body, pawn, World Dynamic, and World Static. I think I've made the light one already. But apart from that there, all of these object types are by default set up in Unreal. If I go to the box one, okay, and come down here, you can see it's got an object type of World Dynamic. So the target was also World Dynamic, but it has a collision preset of Overlap All Dynamic. So basically, instead of blocking anything, it's actually going to overlap with everything, okay? Except for light, okay, which again is a custom one, so we can ignore that at the minute. So that's great for our box because it's an invisible object in the scene, and typically we want to use these collision volumes to overlap with other collision volumes or other objects so that we can execute some event, usually an overlap event in a blueprint. So we're kind of doing that with our projectile. So if I go to weapons, oh, I don't have my projectile in here. Oh, no, I do. There we go. We've got a box collider in here. And if I scroll down into my details panel here, you can see that it's set as a World Dynamic. It's got a custom preset or a collision preset of Overlap All Dynamic. And it means it's going to overlap with everything. Which means that this onComponent begin overlap is able to execute because this here object type and its collision response with other objects is set to overlap, okay? If this was set to ignore and another object was set to ignore, this here would never get executed. Another thing to note is by default, these box volumes do have generate overlap events associated or turned on. Now, if we go into our level here, I am missing my window place actors. There it is. And I drag a cube in. Let's go to collision. You'll notice by default that this here does not generate overlap events, okay? So sometimes, for instance, if we're going to fire a rocket launch projectile and we say, hey, if you overlap with another object, let's just say, that isn't the player because we don't want to blow up the player as soon as we shoot it, this here would never generate an overlap event. So it would never actually make the projectile explode. So we have to keep that in mind. If we ever want to have overlap events, we got to make sure that both objects, let's see, I'll go to custom, are set to overlap. Let's do that. Oh, we're dynamic. Let's keep the rest on block because we want the pawn, which is the player, not being able to walk through it. And we have to have generate overlap event on. Okay. Otherwise, our, you know, fake rocket launcher or rocket would never overlap with this. So let's do a small experiment here. Okay. I'm going to make a new folder in here. I'm going to call it test, okay, because I'll probably delete this afterwards. And in here, I'm going to make a new blueprint class. It's going to be an actor, and we're just going to call this like a physics underscore actor. And I'm going to open this up. Oh, you might notice that I've got like these question marks and everything like that there. It's just I've got source control turned on. Something that you learn in the second year, okay? I was just showing our second years using this project. So just ignore those for now. So if I go to physics actor, I'm going to turn on, or I'm going to make a cube. Okay. And I'm also going to turn on physics on this, okay? So I'm going to turn on simulate physics. So if I drag this into my level, turn up here, press play, it will fall down. Okay, it's going to simulate physics for me, which is pretty cool. Like if I turn it on its side, there we go. One thing that I can do is with this here, if I scroll down to the events, I can have an on component hit. Okay, and if I pull this out, obviously this cube's never going to overlap with the floor. It's going to hit it. All right. So what we can do is we can print out a string if this ever hits anything, okay? So let's press play and see what that happens. Oh, nothing happened, all right? So that's one thing we have to make note. By default, an object typically doesn't have simulation generates hit events, okay? We have to turn that on. So if I press play now, you can see now every time that it's hitting the floor, it's printing out hello. So if you ever want to have or use the on component hit event, you have to make sure that that object, okay, whether it's in a scene, okay, so I can grab just a cube in here, and again I can go down to collisions and turn that on. You have to make sure that simulation generates hit events, okay, otherwise it will never work. So that's hit events, and that's using the simulate physics, okay? And physics is something that we will go into, but if you ever want to turn physics on in an object, all you have to do is click this button and it works automatically. Okay, in our next small test, just to kind of highlight some of the quirks within object collision in Unreal 4, and this probably relates to Unity as well, is we're going to look at our target here, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to get the box and we're going to change the object type of this here. Actually, we'll keep it a world dynamic, but we're going to change some of the responses it has, particularly the one for the pawn. Okay. So if I go to overlap all dynamic, which is a collision preset, and change that to custom, what I can do then is individually determine our object response. Okay. And I'm going to change pawn to ignore. Now, I'm going to compile this and I'm going to open up our character. I'm going to just show you the collision within our character. So our character obviously doesn't have a body or anything. The collision, and this is typical of most first person, third person games, the collision for your character is based on a capsule, okay? So this handles all the collision for us. If I go down to the collision section, you can see it's got a collision preset of pawn, and the pawn basically blocks everything, okay? So the object type is also set to pawn. Now our target is going to ignore pawn object types. So if I was to have an on component begin overlap, and if it overlaps with anything, I will just say And you know what, I'll print out the actor that it's overlapped with. Let's try that. And press play. And oh, let's not shoot it. And I walk over this here. You can see that it's actually not printing out the name of the actual player. What we can do though is, if we, if you're ever having that issue, we could go back to the target select box and go up here and go, oh, you know what, it's ignoring pawn. I can set that to overlap with a pawn instead. So now this should work when we walk over it. If I don't shoot it, that is. So if I walk over, you can see now that it is doing that overlap event. Another thing that we could do is, let's say our target box here, I'm going to scale this out, and instead of overlapping with our pawn, I'm going to set it to block. Okay, so now my target, I can overlap with shooting it, but with my pawn I can't move any farther. Look, you can see the animation still playing. I'm trying to walk into it, but it's blocking my pawn. Okay, so you can have different object responses, okay, to different objects in your scene based on this here setting down there. And again, if you ever want to simulate hit events, you make sure that you have that on. Now, it may come to a stage where, hey, word static is kind of used for like static objects in your level, like, props and scenery that really don't move. Word dynamic is typically used for like dynamic objects in your scene, so maybe projectiles or something like that. A pawn is typically used for characters. Physics body, obviously used for physics type objects, and then vehicle and destructible, I think they're pretty easy to detail. But imagine with your pawn, okay, this is some response that you want to have with your actual player character. But when you develop AI, you want the target to have a different response to them, okay? So maybe like you have spikes on the floor, and if the player walks into them, you want to deal damage to the player. But if enemy, or maybe a certain enemy type, walks into it, you don't want that to deal damage to it, okay? So what we can do is we can go into settings, project settings. Let me move that over. Or if you go to edit, you can also find your project settings in there. And down in here under engine, there's a collision section, okay? So you can see here I've made one for light, okay? I can actually delete that one. And then here we can make object channels and trace channels. Now when we're doing the line trace, we'll kind of cover this, but we're going to just stick with object channels for now. So imagine that we wanted to make a new object channel that had a different response, in our target or something like that. So what we could do is we can just go new object channel, and we could go AI underscore pawn. So we know it's an AI pawn. And then this is important. This is the default response you kind of want objects to have towards this. Now, typically, what you'd want to have is probably an overlap with this, or ignore or something like that there. Or if you think, like objects are typically going to be blocking this object type, you maybe want to have block. So it's up to you what you want to do. I'm just going to set this to overlap and then accept. If I go back to my target now and hit compile, you can see at the very bottom here, we've removed our light channel. But we've got a object response for AI pawn. So what I could say is, hey, I want you to block our player pawn, but I actually want AI pawn to be able to overlap with this, okay? Or it could be that, this blocks AI pawns, but overlaps with our player. So you can kind of put up invisible walls for AI, for instance, or, and let the player through. So that's how you set up custom object types within Unreal. So hopefully you should understand a bit more about how to change collision settings and how to change them to meet your needs, but also how to set up custom collision object types as well on top of that. So in the next video, we're going to use line tracing, and to utilize that there, we kind of have to have a bit of understanding of object types, and we're going to go into trace responses as well. So yeah, check out that next video.